Hello, everybody, and welcome to our 50th installment of What is Truth, where we take an open-ended approach to try and discern what could possibly be the meaning of truth. And of course, we never fully accomplish our goal as it ever recedes, as it's actually something that is a living process of metamorphosis. It's continually undergoing change. And that's part of the beauty of it. And so it's through our unreadiness, in a sense, that we face the future. And as we look at our unreadiness, I'm reminded of Parsifal. And he was shielded from the world because his mother, Hertzloida, had no trust in the affairs of men, having lost her husband to the knighthood. She shielded Parsifal from all the dealings of men, and he lived in the wilderness. And one day out in the wilderness, he ran into some knights in their shining armor. And he was so impressed that he came back and told his mother that he wished to be a knight after he had questioned them regarding who they were and what they were about. And of course, he ends up venturing forth dressed like a bumpkin, with his peasant outfit and his peasant boots, and goes out and faces the world that he's going to become a knight. And of course, all he has is his unreadiness. And it's that enthusiasm which carries him forward. And that's a very important aspect of what we're looking at in this exploration. It brings to mind Rudolf Steiner, who was hearing people being critical of what were the young people, that they were thought of as being unwise. And Rudolf Steiner said, if you are honest in what you want to do, the spiritual world accepts your enthusiasm for wisdom. And so it's kind of a mistake to prematurely judge others regarding whether or not they're prepared to be able to meet the spiritual world. And if you look further at that, you can come to some interesting ideas that I'll try and get a little deeper as we go. But I frequently make mention to the fact that since 1879, we've entered the age of Michael. And Michael means like unto God, meaning he's like the countenance of the divine spiritual powers that are in company with Christ. And so he plays a key role in bringing this understanding of spiritual processes, the cosmic intelligence, to the earthly realm since 1879. But Rudolf Steiner describes his mood of soul as taciturn, that he's not coming in to be a busybody. He's going to sit back and see what you have to bring forward, to contribute to the divine plan of the spiritual powers. And so that's the challenge we live in today. And so in meeting that challenge, I've brought my compatriot here, the Reverend David William Parry, out of London in merry old England. And I'm John Barnwell here in the vicinity of Detroit. the straits. And so, Reverend David, how are you?
Oh, good afternoon, John and everybody. Yes, I'm like the Wicked Witch of the West, slowly melting, only not because anyone's thrown a bucket of water over me, but because of the tropical temperatures that have hit the country. Very lovely, playing havoc with my work and my work schedule, but very lovely. You know, how can we not love our brother, the sun, and the radiance that he gives to all of us? Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you started with Arthurian material. I mean, I was rereading a couple of days ago The Mort d'Arthur by Sir Thomas Malory. I noticed it gave a dear friend of mine and colleague Jeff Lippman a chance to make. I'm struggling not to be rude. A chance to make a wry comment that was obviously based on fantasy, deliberately so, to show the mindset of so many people nowadays that mistake fantasy for imagination and mistake imagination for fact. And there are facts of the imagination as there are facts of reason, but fantasy is none of those things. And yeah, it was a strange thing because I'm very aware, I suppose because I'm British, and that's the matter of Britain, as they used to call it. These things are poetic cycles. They're not meant to be taken as either literal history or indeed, you know, sort of weird occult goings on, although there are clearly occult meanings to all of it. And he said on Facebook, of all things, it was a joke. What if I told you that the sword, by which he meant Excalibur, of course, was the sword of Michael? To which I could only reply something along the lines of, well, yeah, I'd like to know where you got that from and if your sources are reliable, because they're absolutely nothing to do. It was a gag, absolutely nothing to do with anything. But it got me thinking after that, how many people are actually doing that nowadays and getting away with it, where they're not even self-regulating information? You know, I want to think that, so I will. You know, it is madness. Also, as someone that indulges from time to time in poetry, I find that insulting to the muse, that everything has to be reduced to prose thinking and reduced to the mere realm of empirical fact and observance. There are higher worlds, there are higher realms, and poetic expression is one of those things. It also got me thinking along different lines. Believe it or not, I used to love Frankie Howard. I don't know if the British comedian beloved over here ever got over there. I assume he did. He was loosely linked with the Carry On people, although had a completely independent career from them. When he was the character in ancient Rome, he was, well, actually, it was sort of, it wasn't ancient Rome, it would have been ancient Pompeii, forgive me. He was Lurcio, the slave, this wry, taciturn, world-weary individual that brought home some truths about slavery. Back then, not every slave owner was a psychopathic potential murderer at brainwashing everybody in their grip. I mean, it was immoral, don't get me wrong, and it was against the human condition, but it wasn't what certain people are painting it to be nowadays. It wasn't this psychopathic move to dominate others at all costs or they die. It was a business transaction, and people tend to forget in the ancient world some slaves were really sought after, and there used to be fierce bidding in the marketplace. If some sort of chunky hunk turned up, with all the women desperately, all the aristocratic women desperately paying against each other with their agents, because he's going to be in my retinue, or some incredibly knowledgeable Greek turned up, and they all want their kids properly educated, so a bidding war breaks out in the amphitheatre again. So, you know, it was very, very complex. And of course, Lurcio the slave was this completely world-weary individuals had enough, but there we are. He had another incarnation which wasn't as successful. they moved the character and the idea on to the Middle Ages, where he was Lurker-Lot. And I'm reliably informed, I think the movie version was called Up the Chastity Belt, which wasn't as successful for me. I mean, you had some good British comedians. His owner this time was the Baron de Bombast, because of course the tyrants were all French. But by the time you get to the Middle Ages, so the Romans have gone, wheeling the French, and he was one of these sort of seen it all, done it all, can't take any more types, waiting for the Crusaders to come back, which of course they weren't doing, because they discovered, remember, it's a comedy, it's not meant to be taken as literal history or any type of rewriting of traditional sources. All the knights were actually spending years in the Holy Land, because Saladin was actually some sort of property developer. And he was in their world, he was actually some sort of party host. So what they were doing was staying out there for years to see a good time, as opposed to actually do anything terrible, writing back to their wives how awful it was when they were surrounded by courtesans provided by Saladin. Yeah, I mean, what have we forgotten to do in the world nowadays? We've forgotten how to have a good laugh and a good gag, which is why Jeff Lippman horrified me on the one hand and delighted me on the other. And yeah, that's how I'm feeling at the minute. I think that summer talk, that sunshine talk, John, nice to hear you well, and nice to see the show begins with something mysterious and wonderful and truly beautiful.
Yes. Well, actually, your friend is onto something there, because when you look at the sword Excalibur, the sword in the stone, it's an image that is frequently in Grail legends. And Walter Johannes Stein, the author of the 9th century world history in light of the Holy Grail, who was the teacher of a couple of my mentors, and he was one of the people that was really probably seen to be most responsible for widespread reading of Rudolf Steiner's work back in the 1970s, because of the Spear of Destiny by Trevor Ravenscroft, who claimed to be a pupil of Walter Johannes Stein. But he really wasn't a pupil. I mean, I know some people that were pupils, like Werner Glass, my mentor, and another mentor, although not as extensively, Rennie Corrido, who really wrote some nice words regarding my books. But in that regard, Ravenscroft was a guy who wanted to make money selling books, and that which is okay, that's fine. But when he starts writing books that are presenting as fact, things that are his imaginative writings, it becomes not a good thing. And so he was somebody who was kind of around the periphery. They knew him personally, and he was actually somebody who suffered somewhat from, I guess, shell shock from the war. And so he's not the best source, but nonetheless, it became a bestseller and brought many people into the investigation of Rudolf Steiner's writings. And so it's ironic how offhanded events can happen, and the good can somehow flower out. It's like the flowers growing in the manure, you know. It's the old lily bursting up, but yet it's in this dusky swamp, you know. So there's always that this light is going to come forth. But getting into what you're saying, yeah, with the cynicism that one finds today, is an interesting thing, because when you get into what Rudolf Steiner had indicated regarding conscience and wonder and their place in human consciousness at this point in time. And he harkens back to the beginning of understanding wonder has to do with the fact of that when you go back in time, the further back you go, people are more and more aware of the spiritual world. And he says that because of that, and because knowledge was something that they felt streaming into them, that they didn't have this sense of wonder. That the wonder was something that came into the consciousness of man when he started to become more material in his consciousness. And you'd look at things and you didn't understand them and you wondered. And he said, in addition to that, that when you go beyond just wondering about things you'd never seen before, say you're from a very primitive area and then you finally see an automobile and you don't have enough concepts to be able to figure out exactly what's going on. Why is that thing moving? And that's one sense of wonder. I wonder what that is, that new thing. But he says a very interesting, and the details are the important thing. It's all about nuance when you especially when it comes to spiritual science, because he says that the souls that have a sense of wonder about ordinary things, okay, that's your deeper souls, that they can look at a flower and wonder, how it's come into being. Like, look at the in-depth explorations of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe and his Metamorphosis of the Plant that he wrote, and in his coming to understand that metamorphosis was a fact of nature, that it was the way in which nature functioned. And in order to understand anything, you had to be able to bring that into your quiver of arrows that are attempting to figure out this sense of wonder. And that things can be very amazing until you find out what's actually going on. But yet, he says that the birth of science that happened where we, as a mankind, moved from a mythic explanation of reality into where you have Thales. And Thales is considered to be the first philosopher, where he's considered the father of science, and he's looking for worldly answers to things that he was seeing. So you see Aristotle pointing to Thales as being the beginning of all of this. But you could say that Thales, again, he discerned from his temperament, and so to him, it's seen as arising out of water, And so you could look at the different philosophers, and you can see how their temperament shades their conclusions about reality, like Democritus, with his atomism, that he's very much akin to the earthly. He's British, right? His temperament is rooted in that the life ether, the earthly aspect of the four ethers, or the five ethers, really. Well, really, there's seven, but people don't usually talk about the other two. But Rudolf Steiner continues it. He says that people that don't have that faculty, and that they have a different relationship to the world before they were born. And on the other hand, he gets into talking about conscience as something that came forward at a very specific point in time in the dramas of Greece. Up until that time, there was always the Erinyes, the Furies, that would assault one if one had done something wrong. And then you get some of the younger playwrights of the time, like Aeschylus, starts talking about this inner prompting of conscience, and that's the very first representation in art of that whole principle of conscience, something that would later be described by St. John as the still small voice, and that's that voice of the heart. And so you see that there's something that's coming forward. And Rudolf Steiner says that it's that conscience that dwelling in that and having an awareness of consequences. That's the attribute of people that in their past incarnations have developed some understanding of the principles of reincarnation and karma. And he says the people that don't have that, and that don't have, they scoff at spiritual science and all of that, that in their after death state, they're going to meet with a great deal of fear and apprehension and all manner of things, because they haven't yet got to the point to where they're approaching the divine spiritual powers with the proper mood of soul. So it's an interesting challenge. I mean, we can go deeper, but I don't want to belabor the point while we have this eminent Reverend David William Parry here, see what he has to think about Aeschylus and the Furies.
Oh, yeah. Wasn't it Schopenhauer that said he was educated by wonder? That's something that's brushed away far too quickly, actually. That's an extraordinary statement. I mean, I never had him down as the philosopher of pessimism. I never had him down as that. You know, at the end of the day, Schopenhauer believes in something. All he's actually doing, and he wasn't a Buddhist and he wasn't a Hindu. Those texts were being translated and slowly coming into the European intellectual life as he was an old man. Certainly he saw himself as vindicated by the worldview they were giving. That's interesting in itself. And he said something along the lines of, you know, the vast mountain of human knowledge and experience that's in India, that's in, you know, Kantian, Schopenhauerian mathematical physics. And that's a breathtaking statement, and it's full of different levels. I mean, one of the reasons to continue that point, I suppose, is what, you know, I like the existentialist, because I do like the existentialist, because at their best they're approaching every single thing as wonderment. I mean, it comes out better, who was not an existentialist, I suppose, in Wittgenstein. There are two Wittgensteins, the one of the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, and the one, I mean, he, maybe quite rightly, believed he'd solved all the riddles of linguistic philosophy as it was generally known in that book. It is a massive achievement, and most people would consider it a masterpiece. I mean, he was one of those annoying buggers, of course, that wrote another masterpiece called the Philosophical Investigations, which basically says everything I said before was complete trash, forget it. And yeah, we've got a new view. We need a new view. And what interested me, what continues to interest me, well, two things. Bertrand Russell, I met Bertrand Russell when he was very, very old, and I was a very, very young cub. And yes, I know he wrote a book called Why I'm Not a Christian, but let me tell you now from the horse's mouth, he did see why people could become a Quaker. He did see why people could lead a spiritual practice like that. That made complete sense to him. How do I know that? I asked him. You know, so there we are. He couldn't see much sense in sort of the developed forms of Christianity, and he thought they led to inhuman results far too often, but that's a different issue. But certainly the Philosophical Investigations got up Bertie Russell's nose, which was never a bad thing. And it's the fact that Wittgenstein eulogizes creation. Everything is it's wonderment. Everything that exists in some form or other is wonderment, and that is again something that really shouldn't be brushed away. You know, I continually make the gag about the most religious atheist in human history, but I think there's actually a lot more to him than that, which is beginning to come out, like the fact he had a series of mystical experiences during his early life. I don't want to go too much into that, because then I need to start backing up what I'm saying with all sorts of quotes. I don't want to do that. But, you know, he enjoyed mystical experience, and it made him very, very aware that there were states of the pure and there were states of consciousness that were worth cultivating and pursuing. And that in itself, from one of the most important Western philosophers who's ever lived, can't be brushed aside. You know, the fact that these statements are too quickly brushed aside by the present academy is nearly bewildering in its desperate need to prove a certain narrow sort of point. You know, I remember somebody telling me at Goldsmiths, I get invited to these drinks dues every now and again. Somebody telling me with great pride and aplomb that they'd managed to trace the trade flow of what we call flip-flops, beat shoes, to this sweatshop. So from London, the bright lights of gay London, all the way back to a sweatshop somewhere in Indonesia, where the workers were being oppressed. And I didn't doubt that. It just amazed me that was the subject of academic research, and it got a round of applause at the same time. So what you've managed to do is unearth a trade route to a place that's bound to treat workers badly, and that's hailed as what? And this was sort of cutting edge research nowadays. So yeah, no wonder the greats aren't exactly getting the status they deserve. And of course, why I attack that is because if you're not doing likewise nowadays, then you're not accepted into the Western Academy. Let's hope the whole thing falls apart. It's not what it was. It's not what it's doing. Just because it can't find truth, it doesn't mean it's not there. Truth with a capital T. Just because it can't find higher worlds and higher realities, it doesn't mean they're not there. It means they're not looking properly, and maybe they're looking in the other direction because funding doesn't come from that particular one. And certainly the truths of spiritual science, anthroposophy, are mind-blowing. And they're and a part of an ongoing revelation, which has only just started. So I suppose that would be my initial reaction to all of that. I'll pass back to you, John.
Yeah, and Rudolf Steiner says in ancient Greece, the saying arose that all philosophy springs from amazement, from wonder. The experience which lies concealed in the sentence, and it is the experience of the ancient Greeks which is meant, cannot be traced in the most ancient times of Greek development. It is to be found in the history of philosophy only from a certain point of time onward. The reason for this is that in more ancient times, men did not yet feel in this way. But how does it happen that from a certain time onward, just in ancient Greece, men began to realize that they are amazed? And so there's actual historic underpinnings that can be discerned from the thoughtful reader in the ancient writings, and where you see where they shift from this mythic content to trying to give some form of analysis regarding the way in which the world moves, and that the events that take place, why they occur. And you see that now we're at a point in time to where there's a separation happening, and it's of course disconcerting to a large extent, because there's way beyond hubris of those that are refusing to accept the reality of the divine spiritual powers, and that they're encumbered with a form of materialism that is incapable of solving the riddles of the world. And frequently I've said that Rudolf Steiner had said that analytical thinking always leads to conflict. and that he also said that scientific thinking is fundamentally based on fear. And so you see, in light of what I just shared with you regarding that conscience, as Rudolf Steiner describes it, is a faculty that is concerned with your awareness of the consequences of your actions as they will be received by the divine spiritual powers in the next world. That there's, even if it's an unconscious sensitivity, nonetheless, that it's rooted in the spiritual world, and the sense that after one goes through the threshold of death, one goes into what's called in the East Kamaloka, which is the place of desire. Kama, desire, and loka means place in Sanskrit. And so in this Kamaloka experience, in this after death, this purgatory, as Dante would describe it, one gets to experience the drives and urges and impulses of your previous life and the effect you had on others and how they experienced you actually is how the world has met you. And so that you see that when one develops conscience, one has consideration for others and a different way of dealing with the world that the divine spiritual powers are receptive to. And so it's like this whole idea of the taciturn countenance of Michael. He's sitting there, he's sitting back, he's not telling you what to do. He's waiting to see what you'll do, because this cosmic intelligence has to become human intelligence, so that human intelligence can have that transformative impulse that leads into the future in the right way, under the further unfoldment of the Christ mystery, of which we're just really at the beginnings. Even though we're only a couple thousand years into it, we're really at the beginning of something that's unfolding. And so he says that those that scoff at these things, well, they'll have opportunities in later lives to be able to come to understand the reality of conscience being an expression of heaven. Essentially, it's the way in which the heaven world, the beings of the divine spiritual powers that are under the company of Christ, as the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, that triune aspect of deity that Plotinus described as the good, the true, and the beautiful, that Steiner said you could only really comprehend the nature of the spiritual world if you approach it in a threefold way. And so that voice of conscience, that's that heart thing that's going on there. That's the force that actually moves the blood, is tied into that resonant force of conscience. You weigh it in your heart, and it's much like the Papyrus of Ani that I pointed to, where Anubis is weighing the heart against the feather of Ma'at, or truth. And so that was that mythic representation. And really, if you don't make the grade, there's this monster sitting there waiting to gobble you up. So there's this whole idea that there are actions within the human realm that don't meet the approval of the divine spiritual powers, but that we're given the opportunity to freely work in the water, swim in that at times perilous sea of human experience, and given the opportunity to come to it freely of our own free will and accord.
I'm getting better at getting your clues to join in this week. Yeah, I mean, there's a part of me that wishes Michael would get off his butt and actually sort things out a bit more. I'm very wary at the moment I say that, because so many churches and churchmen only really mean prove that I'm right once and for all. Everyone gets biffed, so we were right and you were wrong, which is not really what the Great War is about. And of course, the war, certain people need to be reminded the main war was already won. It's already won, and it was won 2,000 years ago on the cross. So the mopping up is what we're talking about. Gosh, no, you keep referring to people in powdered wigs. Trevor Ravenscroft, I think he should have been more robust. I mean, I'd love a bestseller on that particular scale. If he didn't admit it was a work of faction, I never know what he said about the book. I mean, I never took it at face value, but I never take esoteric works at face value. I didn't know what he was saying. That's incredibly interesting. It strikes me a bit like a Dembski, that was, of course, all a novel to begin with, and he was getting absolutely nowhere. And all of a sudden, all these Venusians are zooming about the space, kidnapping him. So yeah, why not? Why not? Why not? To me, that's beginning to leave fantasy behind and actually engaging in an active imagination, because you're looking at, that wonderful new word. Not all new words are horrible. Some are wonderful. You're looking at acts of faction, which of course must be a way, part fiction, part fact, must be a way of exploring the materials in a very idiosyncratic and personal way, therefore always to be encouraged, provided the author, I suppose, is honest. I mean, my favourite being Baron Munchausen, who of course was based on an actual character. This sort of Falstaffian guy that would apparently he was quite tall and thin. What was that movie based on Baron Munchausen? I can't remember. It made by Terry Gilliam. It nearly bankrupted the studio with all the special effects. And I thought they'd chosen the perfect actor to be the good Baron. It would begin with him at a dinner party in real life, not the movie. And all of a sudden, these embellishments of his place and his role in historical events would somehow go through the stratosphere, and it ended up with him basically having conquered everybody in every way throughout the ages. The best depiction of that in the movie version is when he's on the moon. Yes, Baron Munchausen said he went to the moon. Well, you never know, do you? But unlikely, but you never know. And he meets the King of the Moon, portrayed by Robin Williams in the movie, of course. And they're giants. The people that live on the moon are giants. You've got the tiny little Baron and this huge Robin Williams. In the book as well as the movie, every now and again, the heads of the moon beings detach from their bodies, and they're floating around saying, "I'm free. I'm now free of the temptations of the body. I'm free of all its limitations." Which should be a clue to anybody who's reading it properly that it's a bit of a dig at Descartes and all of that sort of stuff, not to be taken at face value. And of course, it happens because the guy that wrote the book, his name is completely gone at the minute, couldn't resist having digs at the schools of philosophy. The King of the Moon gets an itch on the end of his nose, which he can no longer scratch because his head is separate from his body, and manages to sneeze and blow his head into space so he can't get back to his body. So that's obviously this genius's view of where Cartesian thinking gets you. It reminds me of Francois Rabelais, who is someone I resonate with a great deal. What was it? Science without conscience is the ruin of the soul. What great lines. At MIT and Oxford, they need to be reminded of that a bit more. The Rabelaisian monk, for real. I mean, his sense of humor is unbelievable. And he's chewing, as he says himself, on a Pythagorean bone in his works of faction. About giants. Giants are on my mind a lot at the minute. Gargantua and Pantagruel. And of course, they're actually poetic, and they're humorous prods at what people think they know and how people think they know what they know. And one of the great lines being from somewhere, certain people don't even know what they don't know. which is a classic, one of the classic lines of all time. Yeah, I mean, so you can have humor with wisdom, you can have humor with knowledge, you can have great insight through works of the factional, and if that's a work of faction, my heavens, how far can the imagination go? There was a slight dig there at British scholarship, I seem to recall. Oh my God, am I turning patriotic in my old age? I hope not. I love the culture and I love the countryside. I have an utter detestation of the establishment and its ways and the way it's treated people for hundreds and hundreds of years. There is absolutely no excuse for it. They are rapacious, greedy, ignorant barbarians, and those are just the ones we know about. I rather like British scholars. This will horrify you, John. I found myself life. It gets you into endlessly ironic positions. I found myself defending Richard Dawkins the other day because he was a British scholar. I'm sorry, he's a British scholar. He's every right to be taken seriously. With me stood there thinking, what on earth am I doing? But he was stripped of some humanist awards because he'd questioned the whole trans phenomena. Now, if anybody's reading what he said, and apparently nobody is, what he said was that this isn't an unusual phenomenon in history, but what is happening politically based around the trans movement is it's got major proportions on a cultural level. We should talk about it. My God, what a bastard. He just wants to talk about this political and social phenomena. And why not? I mean, I'm sort of on his side. I mean, I defend Darwin. What was he right about every single thing? No. Did he ever claim to be right about every single thing? No. He was a scholar pursuing scholarly, endeavors. I mean, the one, my favorite, I suppose, I don't know how you'll take to this, is John Locke. I rather like John Locke because it's very difficult not to like John Locke and his humanitarianism. It's very difficult not to like his genuine concern for each individual person and everything. Was he a man of his time? Yes. What else could he be? Was he only looking at the socioeconomic, cultural problems of his day? Yes. What else was he meant to look at? But his approach is enlightening and it's gentle and it's relaxed. I get the impression he would have seen the joy in acts of faction and at the same time had enough intelligence not to let them extend their boundaries. That, of course, is when we start becoming mature and intelligent beings who can discuss all of these various phenomena and what they may mean. I'll hand back to you.
Yes, Francois Rabelais. Yeah, he created an anagram out of his name, Alcofribas Nazier, which is pretty funny. Yeah, he's hilarious. I mean, and what's interesting about his hilarity is it's timeless. I mean, every generation there's been people that have appreciated his work. Cervantes also, but perhaps to a lesser degree because he wrote in Spanish, so he's not as familiar. But if you look within Spanish literature, the place that he maintains is even greater than Francois Rabelais' place in French literature. So it's a very interesting thing to look at. And I think, yeah, we have to have humor. And I've made mention on numerous occasions that on Rudolf Steiner's great sculpture, The Representative of Mankind, his massive carving of Christ holding the balance between Lucifer and Ahriman, and above it is the spirit of mirth. And that, according to a couple friends of mine that had spoken to many people that actually knew Rudolf Steiner, although they were all very different in different disciplines, but one thing they agreed on was he was always telling jokes. And so that lightheartedness is important. But lightheartedness, the capacity to be lighthearted, can be born out of this sense of wonder and this enthusiasm for life, and the willingness to partake on your journey in view of the principles of conscience. And the other side of it is so much that one sees in humor that's what you might call sardonic, and all of that can be very much more an expression of the self-loathing of the comedian. I mean, that's the way I see it for a great many of these comedians, is that they're, your Woody Allens and Jerry Seinfelds of the world, that they're basically trying to deal with their shortcomings through overcompensation, I think. But that's just my thoughts, and I'm sticking to it. But we all do that, and so we're all attempting to craft ourselves into a better version of ourselves. But when you cut yourself off through materialistic forms of thinking, you're separating yourself from the company of Christ, occultly speaking, and that you're entering into the company of the falling spirits. You're a part of that intelligence, and the Christ manifests that intelligence, and his representative in the realm of intelligence is Michael, the leader of the archangels. And then there's an opposing force to that. And that opposing force is going to deny the principle of the Son and want us to just go to where there's just an authoritarian father, that's it, do or die, off with their heads, like the Queen in Alice in Wonderland, So that's the tendency of that materialism, is that it leads to conflict, and it wants to dominate. The reason it wants to dominate is because it's basically built on fear. That's the fruit of a fragmented and partial view of the universe. They keep trying to close the envelope and say, now we've got all our facts straight, therefore, and they're leaving out all this other stuff that is very important. Rudolf Steiner talks about how in the ancient world that they were clairvoyant, and as we moved forward, we get to the time of the birth of conscious with Aeschylus, and the birth of science with Thales, so that there's this transition of consciousness as mankind becomes more earthly, and that when we enter into that realm, then it becomes a different challenge because it internalizes, and that's what's happening, is this internalization of humanness, because in the ancient world it was thought of as something that streams into you. I mean, you can read the writings and that's basically what they say. And so he says, but we do have a remnant of that earlier state of consciousness, and that's the world of dreams. And he says, and you can notice that when you go into the world of dreams, that you could do things that are utterly unbelievable and fantastic, and it's like no big deal. You don't question it. You're flying around in your dream, and it's like, oh, I'm just flying around. That you don't have a wonder about what's going on. Why is this happening? Until when, of course, if one can bring oneself to a sense of self-reference in dream through, principles of there's techniques that can help get you to that point. But in the meantime, most everybody, you don't wonder about what's going on in your dreams. You're caught up in that whole thing. And that was like the consciousness of the ancient world. But that as we develop conscience, then our consciousness is preparing itself to be able to meet the divine spiritual impulses of the spiritual world. And that's what the countenance of Michael is waiting for. He's waiting for us to come to a maturity of consciousness to where we have an awareness of the principles of reincarnation and karma, so that we don't have this utter sense of fear and dread that will be the end game of those that just scoff at these things and can only manifest materialistic forms of consciousness.
Right, you got me that time. Have you noticed in our searchings for truth, this has actually become an anthroposophical show? I mean, nowadays, you're an anthroposophist, I've rejoined, and my writings are becoming increasingly anthroposophic with a capital A, which is, I think, that's interesting as a development in our search for truth. And in one sense, it's quite a formidable anthroposophical experiment. Having said that, let's get back to the gags. I love Mel Brooks at his best. I mean, what was that awful movie? Because it was awful in so many other ways. Where he was looking at European history through the ages. I mean, I love the powdered wig period. Powdered wigs would have suited me to the ground. And you have the incredibly gay Count de Monet when it gets to the French. But it's if you go back before that, the bit that I loved was where Mel Brooks had cast himself as a stand-up philosopher going around the various great houses trying to earn a crust. And I thought, oh my God, really? Was it like one of those? I bet he's right. You had to go at one of my, I love Woody Allen. I'm sorry. I love Woody Allen probably before the debacle we all know about and his permanent exile in Japan. And I'm sorry, Mia Farrow, have more hearts. So we all know what went on there. Let's not reconfigure that. At his best, play it again, Sam. It is this wonderful homage to Bogey, of course, Bogart. And I even love the end. Where you have the spirit, the imaginary Bogart that's guiding the manic depressive failure known as Woody Allen through getting a spine and a backbone. You could see most of Woody Allen's movies as active therapy. So it's been an extended therapy session for years that we've all been invited to take on as well. And of course, the last few minutes is where it goes back into being the movie again. You're in the airport, the propellers of the plane start, and you think, oh my God, all those wonderful movies from the past. He's had one or two good things since the debacle. I sort of liked The Purple Rose of Cairo. Today's a day of mixing fantasy and reality. What a strange, that's just a thread that's emerged, I think. Which, of course, is, I think, Woody Allen at his best and most insecure, where you've got a hypnotist, a stage hypnotist who's put people into a trance-like state and makes them go and do robberies for him, amongst other things. And this wonderful melange of movies and reality. The bit I love is where Mia Farrow, of course, is the star of that movie, the lead. She's gone in yet again to see this trash romantic movie during the matinee because her real home life is so appalling. She lives in an abusive household with someone who really doesn't care about her at all and just wants the menial functions of a household performed at no expense or cost. And of course, the lead on the screen suddenly turns round to her in the audience and says, "You're here every day. Why are you here?" And it all unpacks from there. wonderful. I'm getting two movies muddled up, I think, with that one. And I'll tell you why, because the one I loved was Mighty Aphrodite. Not because, you know, a typical tart with a heart movie. I love the way he did the ancient Greek chorus, which is staggering. That, you know, they're all in their masks, they're all in their long black robes, and there's one point where he's thinking of contacting Zeus. The hero is thinking of contacting Zeus, and the entire chorus goes into these things like, "You never phone, you never write. You know, why don't you get in touch a bit more?" All these wonderful acts of fantasy that lead beyond themselves and tell great truths, or at least lead up to great truths. I've muddled up a couple of movies there. I'm convinced of that, but certainly, Purple Rose of Cairo, the movie, was that the same as the Purple Rose of Cairo? The movie's one I love. And that particular one, Mighty Aphrodite, because of the chorus. John is researching something, so I'll hand it back.
Catch me off on another screen. But yeah, I'm thinking homage to Humphrey Bogart. I always like Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid with Steve Martin, Rachel Ward, old Carl Reiner. Of course, there's no excuse for his son, but we won't get into that. He's just a perfect example of what I've been pointing at as being an abysmal taint of consciousness. And so it gets to the challenge, and it's like I noticed, like in the transition where when I was young, a lot of my Jewish friends they stopped going to shul and started going to psychologists and psychiatrists, you know, and it's like that's like the new religion, you know, is that based on the theories of Sigmund Freud and hopefully at least Carl Jung, but I'm afraid it was primarily Freudian. And it's interesting because his whole premise is based upon his personal pathology. You know, it's like I have a book here somewhere, but Postcards from the End of the World is about the problems of pederasty in turn of the century Vienna, you know, and that he was embroiled in that whole weird scenario, and it seems as though we're embroiled in it again. And so there's that whole challenge of that there are people walking around who do not have a conscience, and it's very clear that they do not, because that's the way they act. They'll say anything to anybody, and they'll do whatever meets their appetite, regardless of what effect it might have. And so when a person like that, as Rudolf Steiner points out, when they cross the threshold, it's a terrifying experience because they have done nothing to meet it. And so they're not going to understand anything that's going on. The capacity to understand the presence of the divine spiritual powers is directly contingent on your ability to develop conscience and also to have a sense of wonder in the world and to find enthusiasm for life rather than a principle of negation that leads to entropy and the collapse, the self-loathing that can only be the end game of living a life without remorse or without conscience. So I don't envy these people. I feel sorry for them because they're willing to say and do most anything. And speaking of that, and so before we run out of time here, I want to remind everybody that we have a wonderful author here with us, the Reverend David William Parry. Here's his Shakespearean study, The Grammar of Witchcraft. And as I always say, it's not a study of witchcraft. And his Shakespearean-esque poetry, Caliban's Redemption, and his major work thus far, although I feel one coming, but his major work, Mount Athos Inside Me, Essays on Religion, Swedenborg and the Arts, it's been very, very well received, edited by the very talented Daniela Irendust. And these are all available on Amazon. And I encourage you, heartily encourage you. He has a masterful skill at writing. He really does. You know, I mean, I'm hard to impress. You know, I've had the pleasure of reading a great many authors, and some of them are good at it, and some ain't. And Reverend David is very good at it, and he has something to say to boot. As for myself, this is my first book, The Arcana of the Grail Angel, The Spiritual Science of the Holy Blood and of the Holy Grail, a study developed out of the work of Rudolf Steiner, the underground streams of esoteric Christianity which flowed from the Brotherhood of the Holy Grail to the Order of the Knights Templar and the True Rosicrucian Order, some 640 pages. And this is what the book's about right here. And it has a great many diagrams, an extensive bibliography, and the complete series of diagrams are repeated in my second book with a great many additions. And so it gives you a cosmological way of approaching the work of Rudolf Steiner in spiritual science. And so it lays out the correspondences and how it all fits together as a cosmic scheme. And the second book is The Arcana of Light on the Path, which is more of a meditative tool, slender volume. They're both available on eBay from me directly. If you're outside the country, of course, you can contact me directly through my academia link, which is posted below, or you can private message me on Facebook. And I'd be more than happy to make arrangements for you to get books. I've been able to do that for people various places around the world. And also, if you're interested in buying us a cup of coffee, seeing as how we tend to drink lots of it, you can go to paypal.me/dperry777 or buymeacoffee.com/dperry777. That's another one he's got going there. I don't know anything about that. But, and for me, it's paypal.me/John Barnwell 888. And it'd be very much appreciated if anybody feels so moved to share a cup of coffee or something, you know, any amount. None's too small. Of course, none's too big. And that being said, yeah, I think that I'm with you. I mean, I continually am striving to find some form of levity. Things can get so heavy because, especially with what's been going on in current events that we don't need to get into because that's what everybody seems to be talking about. And they're having their own little conversation over here. And so I can't follow it. But in any regard, as we try and piece things together on the other side of things, that we try and find maybe an artistic approach as an antidote to some of these challenges. And the comments that I shared at the very beginning regarding what Rudolf Steiner had said about the young people that were being looked askance by some of the older members. And he he pointed out it's their enthusiasm for what they're doing that makes their deeds acceptable to the spiritual world and divine spiritual powers. And so that's, I think, a point at which we can really take it to heart, is that you may think, well, geez, I don't know all this stuff. What am I supposed to do? It's like, well, it's in the words of Goethe, first commit, and then the whole world will rise to help you. And so that's some of it. It's not. I remember that Parsifal was a bumpkin. He didn't know anything, and yet he became the knight who achieved the Grail, and it was the purity of his striving. It was his enthusiasm, rather than being enfolded by all the rules of knighthood that he didn't know. And he goes out as a bumpkin, and who does he end up encountering but the Red Knight? And so what is that Red Knight? That's like the whole idea of the embodiment of that principle of warfare and terror and all of that. And yet he conquers the Red Knight, and he takes the Red Knight's armor. And so he gets to be the Red Knight now, because he's overcome that lower challenge of the forces of the blood that's symbolized by that red armor. And so there's always something along the way, but it's important to realize that in taking cosmic intelligence and making it human intelligence, it's not necessarily how much you know that gets you there. It's a qualitative thing. It's not a quantitative pursuit. And so in committing yourself to be on the side of goodness, that's what makes you a Knight of the Grail, not that you have more information than the guy next door.
Well, no, I mean, we live in a sort of fact-heavy society, and there's nothing wrong with that. And personally, I hope we get even more fact-heavy. There's the old Hegelian in me, that every single fact and truth and evidence that's unearthed is yet another demonstration of the universal spirit of God. There's that, God, that guy won't get out of my head. What was that song? Because I think, if you see him as a Lutheran, which he was, then the whole thing takes on a slightly different flavor. Yeah, I mean, you're right. Your prophetic streak is working. I am in the closing stages of my next book, and thank you very much for your kind words. I hope to be able to live up to some of them. Yeah, as I say, the short, fat, puff burster. I think empathy is the key. I think you develop empathy through humor. Humor is empathy. You see the best, you see the failing, you see the humanity of people around you. Humor is this magical ability to be able to survive the vicissitudes. It's very underrated. I mean, I hate woke humor because it's basically a less basic lesson in morality by people most of the time in no position to give you any lessons in morality at all. So yeah, let's embrace the humorous too. I mean, I decided the other evening that I was actually the reincarnation of Lawrence Stern, who of course wrote Tristram, if anyone's interested, Tristram Shandy. What was it? I can't remember the whole subtitle. The Opinions of a Gentleman. I remember that bit. Because Lawrence Stern, of course, was also a clergyman interested in getting bastards to try and feel more as opposed to actually just accumulate facts. I'll get back to him. I mean, W.G. Grace. Yes, look, I'm British. I like cricket. There we are. I mean, I think I might have said it before. Got absolutely drunk one night at Lord's and jumped on the table shouting, heads, heads. Any old cabbage has a head. What God wants is a heart. And since he's a famous British cricketer, he's forgiven. But he's on the right lines. Lawrence Stern was of that other hidden British tradition that thinks humanity is really the basic thing that counts. It's a humorous unfoldment of faction, more towards fantasy in this particular case, where he uses his hero to point out things. And I think that's very important. I mean, as I say, he was a clergyman, treated very, very badly, wrote a masterpiece admired by the likes of Schopenhauer, who saw it as one of the great romances. Let's not forget the human. I mean, there was a political crisis not long ago. I have a habit of preaching on Facebook when people get up my nose, so I post things to balance an issue. There's no point arguing with them unless you've got to. You know, there was some new crisis that was building and everybody was arming themselves to the teeth. So I decided to put on a medley of tunes from Camelot, the musical, and, you know, it seemed to work. I remember people saying, "Oh, God, it's all so depressing. That was a lovely song." So, you know, let's accentuate the human and the positive a bit more. Yeah, my new work, I've not decided yet whether it's a collection of short stories. I'm experimenting with the short story at the minute, or whether it's an in-your-face novel. I mean, I loved writing the essays that became Athos, but I mean, I was asked to. It's not really a genre that I want to explore beyond a certain point. Whereas the novel, of course, for me is something extraordinary. And I've been a hypocrite, I confess. If I really do believe that the novel can outmaster any graph put together on the world for unveiling a truth, then it's time to stake my colours to the mast. And as the reincarnation of Lawrence Stern, I hope I can live up to that. I can't see what the time is, John. There's something weird with my screen. I'll hand back to you because I'm floundering because I since I don't know whether it's my slot or not to do the prayer. Handing back from an old, short, fat pup who's a new, reborn anthroposophist.
Well, yes, it gets into, again, this whole concept of as I was saying, that it's our enthusiasm that as we begin to consciously build our intention, that we're seeing ourselves as participating in life in such a way that we actually consider ourselves to have the spiritual path. It's that inner warmth of the ego. That's that the qualitative aspect of the path itself, and that, you know, not that you're supposed to run around hugging everybody, but that you have that consideration, and you begin to observe yourself and watch the way in which you respond to people. And it's challenging because when you're caught up in the drama of the world, it's not always easy to be able to put on your best behavior. But it's in understanding this whole aspect of Parsifal. It has to do with the letting go of that materialistic outwardness that reins one in, that you're just being held by conventions, and so many you see in these. I mean, so many of these, like Jane Austen and all these great novels, and you go, why doesn't he just tell her? But he never does, and so the whole thing falls apart, and all this tragedy begins, and then they finally come together, and finally somebody gets to the point to where they're actually capable of expressing their feelings, which is like a highly un-British thing to do. Then you see the story come to a happy ending. But it's a heartfelt tragedy, and you see it in all these various authors, like your Tristram Shandy, and you also see it in the French. But there's kind of more intellectualism in the French novels, like George Sand. I know you don't like me saying that, but it's true. And if you don't believe me, just ask a Frenchman. Oh, he wants to say something.
Bunch of French puffs. That's what. Yeah, but look, you've got. I mean, I think curiously that comes out of the philosophical divide. I mean, broad brushstrokes. You can basically see your Krauts, your Germans as idealists, and look where that goes wrong. So you can see them as idealists. You can see the French as Nancy boy rationalists. Everything's got to have an argument behind it. Even Moliere, I've got to justify my statement. Sod off. No, you don't. I think there's the mighty spirit of John Locke behind. Oh, I love John Locke. Behind what we do. I mean, Tristram Shandy's the perfect example of someone actually sticking rigidly to those principles, like the tabula rasa. The mind isn't, and I'm not sure I even agree with this, the mind isn't born. It's not like a planted garden. I mean, William Blake would have said it is. The Platonists would say it is. But, Locke, there may be very strong reasons why he said that in a sort of double-edged way. He's convinced it's not. I mean, he starts that modern view that the mind is a blank slate that we write on. And that makes the comedic element of Tristram Shandy even more profound, because you think, what are these grossly inadequate people doing in the formation of this character? Oh my God, you brought someone else to mind, John. There used to be a comedian I admire hugely, and his name is completely the real genius. I mean, if people are looking for genius in the old comedians, in the old comedies, we had a series of movies over here called carry-on movies. They were at their best when they were sort of costume comedies. I remember Carry On Up the Khyber, where you have Sid James as Sir Sidney Rough Diamond, the Viceroy of India, this inadequate human being trying to hold everything together against the odds. Or his wife was Lady Rough Diamond, played by Joan Sims. I met Joan Sims outside of Marks and Spencer's in Great Marlborough Street years ago. She got out a limo, and I thought, oh my God, it's Joan Sims. And I was so overawed. For once, I had absolutely nothing to say. That's the power of humour. Oh, yeah, I'll hand it back to you. I've got to remember this guy's name, because there was a real genius at the back of it all. I think he took his own life. I can't remember. The lad, Tony Hancock. That was someone no one would work with. A complete, as the saying goes, a complete Lockean, who was obsessed with the infinity of the human condition. He made his career through comedy. He was a very, very sad man in his personal life. The comedy is incredible. It starts so-called alternative comedy. He's never given the credit for that, but it actually originates with him, not the goons. The goons, Peter Sellers and all that lot after the war, being crazy young guys coming back and making fun of everything, lampooning everything. But that really is a sort of a miasma of cultural effects. It's Tony Hancock that starts it, and apparently people hated working with him because during rests, you'd be doing your rehearsing in rest. He'd go along lecturing them of the infinity of the human condition and how were they living up to it? Are you living up to the fact there's infinity inside you? So no one wanted to work with him, but a great genius. No, I think, the French feel the need to justify, and I think, if I'm not being incredibly British for a minute, it is important, particularly maybe in the arts, although nowadays it's fallen into justification alone, and that's not as good. Why are we doing this? Well, we're doing this because it's an exercise in generating money for tourists, which is not what the arts should be doing. I think there's more of an instinctive empiricism. Can't believe I've just said that, in the British arts, whereby description takes the place of rational argument. And it's almost like, I mean, it's in Dickens, you know, what he wants to do, he sees himself clearly as an educator. By the time you get to the mature Dickens, it's taken a very, he's still the moral giant, but it's taken this different turn. And when you get to Hard Times and that monster, Mr. Gradgrind, who simply cannot empathize, and you get the impression from the character he doesn't want to, it would really upset his universe too much if he started empathizing about other human beings. So no, I think we've got to British arts, British comedy, British plays certainly are reaching towards the instinctive, and I can't quite believe I'm saying that. That's a thought that's hovering in my mind at the minute. And we're not looking for justifications. We're not looking for rational arguments. We're looking for scenarios that manage to show what they are, and then you make your own personal existential judgment based on that. So it beats the French puffs any day of the week. That's what I say. Handing back to you, John.
Yeah, well, I think that part of the difficulty with French culture is they tend to take themselves too seriously. And I remember when I was in the music business, this trade publication that you get, there was a monthly roster of every record company, the major labels and the major minor labels, and everybody that had a record deal in the industry was in this publication, and it had the phone numbers and all that for the A&R people and all the different people that were involved. And it was interesting because amidst that, I realized that there was basically a couple thousand record deals available, between 2,000 and 2,500 record deals available with major labels and major minor labels, period. That was it. So that if you didn't make their seal of approval, well, you'd be working at the local pub or what have you. And so that's that world of the arts. But it's interesting because when the music business became an industry, the music industry was back really in the 70s. You know, when for example, Jimi Hendrix got a record deal with Reprise Records, which was Frank Sinatra's label, and they thought like a big selling record was 40,000 copies. Jimi Hendrix gets on there and starts selling millions of copies. And they're like, what? And so it gradually through the 70s, it drew the attention of the lawyers. And once you get the lawyers involved in anything creative, it's the beginning of the end. And so it's like the death of culture. And we all know what Shakespeare said about lawyers, so no need to repeat it here. But there is that whole kind of legalistic almost mindset in French culture, which is interesting. And don't forget the existentialists. That's basically a French thing, and you're so deeply into that existential thing. I think you're even still waiting for Godot, but it's okay. I explore anything you want. The point that I guess I'm trying to make is that self-loathing as a resource for humor is really that's at the core of so much of what you see that's posing as humor. And it's interesting because really today they don't have comedians anymore. The proper behavior in society doesn't include humor, making fun of things. And so consequently, a lot of the people that we thought were funny, well, they couldn't get on TV today. And that's, I guess, the way it goes when you enter into a humorless society, an authoritarian society that's trying to determine what they think your behavior should be. You know, you're going to be looking for the door. It's like, who are you? How'd you get in here? How do I get out of here? And that's of course that to be expected, and then so much of that's going on right now, and in light of that, we don't want to lose our enthusiasm, because if you not careful when you confront your enemies, you may become them.
That one did get me. Lawyers. I love Dolly Parton going on about the music industry because it's genuinely funny. I don't think she realizes that. Every gay man's icon anyway. Oh, Dolly, we love you. Yeah, I know. Oh, yeah, I suppose I am obsessed with the existentialists. I admit it. They're very, very, very good at questions. They're absolutely crap at solutions. But you know, they penetrate into the human condition and what it means in its own terms. Therefore, they're on the edge of spirituality all the time. But for various reasons, your French poofters won't. I'm sorry, you started me now. The French won't commit. I mean, the exception to that is Gabriel Marcel, who even Jean-Paul Sartre admitted was an existentialist, a Christian existentialist. I wasn't sure for years that was even a legitimate position, but I think it is. And if anyone's not read him amongst the existentialists, then that's a shame, because he's on the verge of writing genuine theology in a sense that most theology isn't nowadays. And he will talk about, oh, that's a show we need to do separately, I think. He will talk about how religious terms actually do have a legitimacy in modern discourse, and we mustn't just assume they have legitimacy. We mustn't be like the Catholics and the Orthodox, therefore they're legitimate. He's saying, well, no, the zeitgeist, society, culture's moved on. We mustn't do that. And if we're not doing that, what does it mean? And he's incredibly good at showing how authenticity, one of the big bugbears, one of the big worries of the existentialists, is not only a legitimate question in its own right, are we ever authentic and what would that mean? But also he says, but if the minute we take that seriously, that's begging metaphysical issues. And of course, metaphysics was the big no-no until recently. The philosophers tried to deliver a killing blow to metaphysics for all the right reasons. I'm a great admirer of the philosophers. The likes of Diderot, what they wanted to do was stop religious wars. They found that deeply offensive. So they were trying to put human knowledge on the, paraphrasing, sure and certain ground of the natural sciences, without realizing where that could go. I mean, the natural sciences are what finance makes them. But, you know, that was a good enterprise, and it eventually leads organically, if you're looking at French culture, I propose, to the existentialists, which begin to question that entire enterprise. Okay, we've done that, but where has it led and what does it mean? I greatly admire Jean-Paul Sartre, short and pushy, but an interesting guy. I love reading Nausea. It makes me sick in various places. But, you know, the life of Roquetat, the anti-hero, you know, he finds the great abundance of the natural order too much to deal with. Get a life, man. Get a life. Enjoy yourself. Have a cocktail. Go and see a play. Read some poetry. Why do you find its abundance overwhelming? Have a nice evening. You know, and without looking at the existentialists and their entire challenge to the edifice of modernism itself, you don't really get why that's important, and the fact religion and spirituality have a legitimate areas of discourse and they don't constantly have to be on the receiving end of the allegedly crushing natural sciences, for the simple reason they're asking different sorts of things, and so they're talking about qualitatively. So I'll hand it back to you, John. You've got that. We're out of time.
Am I that easy to read? Oh, that's good. But I hope that we have heartened people to try and look upon the flowers with a sense of wonder, and to be amazed at the works that you find in nature. Like I was saying last week, Japanese studies showing that a walk in the woods can improve your immune system by more than 30%. So that these words are not only good, they're good for you. And so that it's meant in only the most positive sense that we can work with this. Even though, getting back to the French, we are out of time, but I never got to finish my story. Why I started talking about French in the first place. I used to get Billboard magazine too, and then it would have the record charts all around the world of who had hit records. And it was like, Michael Jackson was everywhere, and all these various acts. But then you look at France, and it was like all these French artists that they're insular, and you get into French culture itself, and then within that being insular about being French, then you have the Parisians, and they're insular about being Parisian. You're either a Parisian or you're not, and so it's exclusive club, which is interesting because there's a long history of that exclusivity, and in that the French was the court language of Europe, so in all the royal courts they all spoke French. Even like the Tsar, he only spoke Russian to his servants and his dog, so they could speak amongst the noble houses. They could speak to each other, and they didn't have to worry about people listening in because the servants didn't know French, regardless of what country they were in, supposedly. And in fact, they didn't want servants around that knew French for that very reason, because then they'd have to guard their speech so much. But so you have this whole idea of overcoming that insular and that containment, that can be extended into the realm of thought with materialism. That there's only material answers to the problems of the world. It's like, oh, really? And to be able to get beyond that to a universally good level of understanding, that not to be against any particular group or anything, that the strivings that Michael's taciturn countenance is looking for is for it to freely arise out of mankind, that they come to that universally human understanding that is represented by the Christ principle. So in light of that, if Reverend David could lead us in his weekly prayer as an offering to kind of sanctify our little gathering here.
I've got to add one last thing. Like every other British intellectual, the moment I get the chance to live in Paris and mix with them, I will be there like a shot. So anyway, oh, my friends, we come to the end of another wonderful show. Thank you, my good friend John. Thank you, viewers and listeners, for being with us. I don't know, what do I want to say? I mean, let's wish the good for each other in the days ahead before we all meet again. Let's wish the true for each other, that we can all lead better lives being truer to ourselves. And let's wish the beautiful to each other, because in this increasingly ugly world, beautiful things are turning invisible, even though we're surrounded by them. So I suppose, as a short fact, Puff, I want to say something from a Puritan. The words of John Bunyan, have always struck me as the most important prayerful saying. My friends, let's all try and be of good cheer, for all is well. In the name of Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for showing up, and for anybody that may see this in the future. And